Welcome to another edition of Warmaster's Workshop. Today we're going to be working on putting together plastic Mandalorian vambraces, or gauntlets as we like to call them in the Mandalorian Mercs community. These are made out of expanded PVC foam board. That's what we're going to be working with today. Sintra, as the name brand is called. They're not overly difficult to do. Probably the most difficult part is doing the upper box housings. You know, depending on what you want to do, we're doing something that's totally custom today. So patterning out your boxes and that kind of stuff is always the most difficult part. So I'm going to go over some of that patterning as well, as best as I can in this video without making it too overly long. But these gauntlets, we're using Velcro as the enclosure for the gauntlets, and it does keep them closed. Of course, it does give them a little bit of a lip, as you can see here, a little overlapping lip there. But, I mean, that's just the nature of the beast when you're using Velcro. But as you can see, they're not going to come apart easily using industrial Velcro. So where we start with this is we start with the patterns, of course. And these patterns are available on the Mandalorian Mercs website, www.mandalorianmercs.org. Just go to the tutorials and templates section, and you'll find the gauntlet templates for Boba Fett, which that's what these are. And you cut them out, or you'll print them out, and these are actually printed at 290% of what they would have come out of the printer normally as. What I do is I use Adobe DC. You can also use older versions, Adobe Reader, whatever, and you can do a print preview. And right before you print them, it gives you the option to custom scale the objects. So I scale them down. These were down to 290%. For guys, I would probably start around 250% and work your way up from there, and just see what works the best. You know, you can print these out as many times as you want, tape them together, and see what seems to fit you the best. Always remember that if you are using Velcro if you are using the Velcro enclosure on these, that you want to account for the overlap, a little bit of that overlap when you do your measurements. So for ladies, I would probably start out at around maybe 225 or 220%, and do your rescaling from there up. You start getting too small, and what happens is when you're shrinking that down, you're not just shrinking the width, but you're also shrinking the length. So you don't want to end up with with a vambrace that's only like 4 inches in length. That would be tiny on anybody's wrist. It'd be almost like a bracelet at that point. So anyway, these are our patterns. You'll cut them out. I like to tape them together. There's two halves. There's an inner half and an outer half for each part of the clamshell. You will put those edge to edge. Usually you'll line them up on the outer edges, and then you'll just tape them. That's what I do, and that gives you the full pattern. Now, if you want to do the actual the blocks, cut out the blocks in the center on the lower half. I mean, the blocks on the edge on the lower half. You can flip the pattern back over. I believe I've actually got these switched where the inner shell should go on the back side. But you may or may not be able to see. I'll hold this up. You might be able to see the outline of the blocks here. You can just cut those out of the pattern and trace them onto the Sintra as well, and that will give you those little blocks from Boba's gauntlet, if that's what you want to add. I don't really like to add those because they decrease structural integrity. So, and then once you've got your patterns done, you can cut out your plates. Now, I've already cut the bottom and top half of the Sintra clamshells out. One piece of advice when you're doing this is go slowly with your X-Acto knife. One reason is for safety. The other reason is because you're going to get a much better cut. You'll get a nice straight cut, or as straight as you can humanly make it, if you use patience with your X-Acto knife. Now it's not going to be absolutely perfect, but you can get a really, fairly straight cut, and then you can fine-tune it with your sandpaper, as you go along. But you'll cut these out, and as you can tell, the bottom half always has this little lip. If you're doing the boba pattern, always has this little tab, I should say. There's a little tab on the edge, and that will go on the outside. So it'll go like this. That's how it's going to sit on your arm, with that tab on the outside. All right, and then of course the upper half is pretty self-explanatory. If you have any marks, make sure those are on the inside. So those are our patterns there. Now another important pattern that you want to cut out of these is the rolling pattern. Okay, to get the roll on the gauntlets when you're heating them up and you're rolling them. So what I do is I take a piece of 6mm Sintra, and you can use wood, you can use metal, whatever you've got. You can use a couple of pieces of 3mm Sintra and just glue them together. But what I do is I cut this out. This is called a jig, and what we do is when we heat up the Sintra, we stand this up and we put the Sintra over it, and then we hold it down over the top to get that nice roll. Now, if you have access to a vise like I do, which we'll be using, we'll put this in a vise and we'll roll it over the vise. That way, we get a nice smooth roll. We don't have to worry about it wobbling back and forth as we're trying to roll the gauntlets. But this wider U is for the back of the gauntlet. Okay, the wide U on the outside. Now on the inside, you can cut that out if you want. I choose not to, just because I like having the extra stability. I just eyeball it. I traced my line based on the pattern, but the inside is for the front roll at the very front of the gauntlet. So this roll right here, okay, and down here, but more really the top is the one that matters the most with that. So as you can see, and you can even see there's some seam lines that were pressed in here when we heated it up and pressed it in. You can see those little seam lines, which actually help expand the back of the gauntlet a little bit so that it fits and feels a little bit more comfortable. Okay, but this jig, it fits, it fits right in there as you're rolling it. Same thing with the front. I just tend to eyeball it. I don't know how good you can see that on the camera, but I tend to eyeball the roll based on that incline. And it's pretty darn close. The roll's pretty close to that incline there. So anyway, that's our rolling jig, and we'll use that later. But that's probably the second most important part of the patterns, is cutting that little roll jig pattern out. So and then of course next, this is a pattern that I made while putting the other gauntlet together. This is just a custom box pattern. We use that for making the box that's on top of this gauntlet right here. That pattern basically made this. And then of course we have another small pattern that I used here to close it with. And then we've got, we'll make our front pattern. Our front pattern is actually pretty easy. You just set it down and you'll trace this front area over a piece of paper. I'll show you how to do that. It's not hard. And you can make the closure for the box right here in the front. So, and with that too, you can add little things later on down the line. If you want to put a couple of little blaster cannons, you could maybe drill a couple little holes and put two little metal tubes popping out of there like blaster cannons, or you can cut a nice square in here, and underneath maybe put some keys so it looks like a bezel with keys and buttons up there that you would push to do things. So some electronics, you could actually put some LEDs in here and cut the inside out. You can cut out on the inside here so you can fit a battery up in there and have some electronics with some lights and all those kind of little things. So there's lots of potential. Once you get your gauntlets made, as far as once you get the basic part of the gauntlet done, which is this part, then you can kind of go a little bit more in-depth on the creativity side. But today I'm just showing you how to get it to this point, just to make the bare gauntlet. Okay, so what we've done here is I've brought over my vise that goes on my drill press. It's also kind of a little portable vise, small vise, and this works perfect for what we're needing it here for. But I've got my jig, my rolling jig, set up in the vise, and I'm getting ready to heat and roll the lower half of the clamshell here. And what else we've done here is, I'm hoping you can see it, but I've made a little, get a pointer here. I made a little eye out of pencil so that I know that this is the inside piece, that this needs to be the inside, okay? Which means we'll be rolling it this way with the eye on the inside, okay? Let me move this up a little bit. And we're rolling it this way. So what we need to do now is heat and roll this. Now, you've got to be real careful when we heat this, because you've got to heat more than just the back part that you're rolling. You've got to heat it down the center as well. Otherwise, what will happen is, as you're rolling it, this whole area here will not be hot. So it will not want to take that shape, and it will just sort of concave inward, and it will leave you with a lot of work you've got to do to get the waviness out. It'll be tremendously wavy, and we just don't want to have to deal with that. So we'll heat the center up as we heat the back edge up as well. Now we're going to glove up here, because we are going to be working with some hot material, and we are going to be working with a heat gun, and safety first, okay? So let's grab our heat gun here. I've got my heat gun out. I've got it set to maximum heat setting here, because I do want to get this thing nice and hot along the back and the middle. What's going to happen is as this plastic here starts to get hot, the surface texture is going to change, and it's going to become, you're going to see a texture start to form in the warm areas, or where it gets hot, okay? So you want to look for that texture. The shine, it's going to kind of get a little more shiny, and it's going to get kind of a wavy surface texture going on, and that's what we're looking for, and that's when we know it's time to start rolling it. Alright, so let's go ahead and apply heat. I'm sorry if it gets a little bit noisy. That's just the nature of the heat gun. Always remember too to heat your Sintra in a ventilated area. I have an air conditioner on in here, so that's pretty helpful. I don't know if you can see it, but the surface texture is starting to change a good bit. And you can see it starting to sag a little bit in the back. Make sure you aim your heat gun away from your hands as much as possible. I think this is probably warm enough to go ahead and... So let's go ahead and we're going to roll this sucker around. Now what we're doing down here in the back is we're making sure that the piece, there'll be a little bit of overhang on this jig. You want to try to keep that. You want to try to keep that overhang a similar amount on either side. So there'll be a little bit of the center that overhangs from the jig, and you want to make sure that that amount is relatively even on each side. That way you know that your gauntlet clamshell is even. So we're going to sit here and hold this for a little bit until we know it's cool. In fact, take the glove off and feel it here. It's still pretty warm. Yep, there we go. Now it's cooled off a good bit. Okay. Now, see how we got that nice roll going on in there? And you can see how that seam from pushing it down is kind of formed a little bit. And then we put it back over the jig. It fits right back over the jig like perfect. So there's still some areas we're going to have to heat. We're going to have to heat a little bit right in here, but we'll do that as we start to worry about the front. Okay, so let's go ahead and heat the front and start getting that one formed up, I'm sorry. And if you want to, you can hit this little area. We'll hit this little area in the back that we had square up on us. Alright, so now what I like to do with this front, and I don't know why I didn't bring one over here with me, but I like to use a piece of PVC. Excuse the loudness. I'll take a piece of PVC like this, and I'll use that to help me get this thing into the proper frontal shape. You can also use your hands. So once it's cooled off a bit, you'll have some good. You'll be able to move it around fairly well with your hands. But it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but it should be. It should have a taper, okay? It should move from a sharper taper in the front to a wider taper in the back. And you can put your arm in it as well, like this. And if your arm fits in it, then you've got a pretty good angle or pretty good roll going on. And then you've got a good taper angle. So yeah, so this one's pretty much good to go. We've got the bottom half rolled. So let's go ahead and do the top half. We'll set that down right here. And we'll go back to, we'll heat this up just like we did. We'll heat this part up, just like we did with the bottom half. Now the top half is it matters a little bit more that we get that one fairly nice and straight, because that's where we're going to be putting that's where you're going to have your box for your missiles or your electronics or that kind of thing. So we want it to be as straight as possible. So now we're going to go back down again, just like we did with the other one. And it's not too hot that I can't hold it with my hand. If it was, I would not be holding it with my hand right now. And then, of course, just make sure that you get a nice curve. You've got to have that starter curve. If you don't, I'm telling you, it's going to be heck to try to put it in there after you've already got the back heated up. So and then we use our piece of PVC. To get that front nice and curled in. Then make sure you put it back on the back. And toss it back on the jig just to make sure that we get that nice even roll as best as possible. And you can manipulate it a bit with your hands if you need to. I like to try to work out some of these indented areas. Try to keep that edge as straight as possible. It's very important that that edge stays straight. Okay. And I think we've got it pretty straight on ours before it completely loses all of its heat. And now we can compare it to the one that we've already made to see how we look. And when we compare it to the one we've already done, look at that. It's just about a perfect match. So we know that the box pattern is going to fit perfectly on top of this one. Alright, and then when we go edge to edge here, we see, we're a little bit wide in the back, a little bit wide. So we need to heat the back up again and get that curled around one more time. So let's do that. It's always a work in progress. There's no perfect way to do it. You just kind of have to work at it as best you can here. The main thing is keeping those edges straight. You've got to have straight edges. If your edges aren't straight, it's not going to work. So what we'll do is we'll put it on this. We'll use these and we'll meet it. Try to meet it edge to edge here as best as possible so that we know we've got perfect edges. Of course, remember you've got to allow for that overlap at the bottom for when you're putting them together. So you want to allow a little bit of overlap there. So you want the top to be a little bit bigger than the bottom if you can help it, that curve. And this should be the last bit that we've got to do to it here. Yep, I think that's got it. So when we put this together, it's going to fit almost perfectly right there. So that should be, yeah, just about perfect. Okay, so I think we've got ourselves to where we want to be. Again, you can try this on just to make sure. This is the wrong arm, but it's the only free arm I've got at the moment. And that should work. Yep, it's a little high, but for what it would normally sit, but that should work fine. So now we've got our top and we've got our bottom done. And we're going to be building the box for these. Alright? That's our next step. We've got both sides of our clamshells formed up, rolled out to our final rolled forms here. Now, a lot of people will say, well, why can't we just leave the clamshell like this and wear it like that? Well, it looks unfinished. There's no detail. You know, even if you could probably just glue some parts on there, but the problem you come into with that is that the parts don't look like they're incorporated into the gauntlet. They just look like they're stuck on there. So we don't want to do that because that's a quality issue. You want these things to look nice, and you also want to add some details to them that may even help improve the overall strength of the gauntlet themselves. So with that being the case, what I've done is I have patterned out a box that fits on top of the Vambrace clamshell here, and what it does is, and I've already folded it over before when I was building the Vambrace for the left hand. But what it does is it just creates a small box that fits on the top. Okay, it'll sit, right about there or so. That will it will add a layer of detail onto the gauntlet, plus it'll add a little bit of structural integrity as well to the gauntlet. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this box. Okay, we're going to cut this out of some Sintra, but I'm going to show you real quick. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview on how to do patterning, because I could do a whole Warmaster's workshop just on making patterns like this, because it's you know, it's a very involved process. It does require a good bit of patience and time and measurements. So I'm just going to show you just a brief overview of what I did in order to create this this box pattern. So what I did was, the first thing was I measured the top of the gauntlet and how much area I thought the box needed to cover. And I just took a little ruler and I said, well, you know, 6 inches looks like a good amount of coverage for a gauntlet box, because it's going to leave a small lip at the front and it's going to leave a small lip at the back, you know, which is very similar to how, you know, how some of the in-cannon gauntlets are anyway. So I said 6 inches is kind of what I want to do. So let's go with the 6 inch box pattern. So thinking on that line, what I did was I took a piece of paper and I just measured. I used the L square here just so that I could get a center line, okay, and a good straight center line. So I used the edge of my work area here just to square up. Now you can use a T-square also. In fact, the T-square is probably a little bit easier to do. But I'd put my piece of paper in, you know, here at the L square, and I would find my center line, okay, which was right here. So this was my center line. This line here is the exact center of the pattern. So once you find your center line, then you can that gives you a really good idea of where to go from there on your pattern measurements. And then, you know, I said, well, it needs to be wide enough to cover the top. I'm going to use this gauntlet that's already made to cover the top. Okay, it needs to be wide enough to cover the top, but to also reach the sides at the back. And it also needs to be thin enough at the front so that it matches the same taper of the gauntlet. Okay, so you got to make sure that any box that you create is wide enough at the back so that it matches up with the roll here that you've got at the back, but it also needs to taper slightly, okay, and come up front. So what I did was I measured the back of this pattern. I believe is 3 inches. If we measure it, it should come in right around 3 inches, or right, I think it's right under 3 inches. It's actually 3 inches. It's actually 2 7/8. And then what I did up here was I took a little bit off and made it 2.5 inches up front. So it's not a huge taper, okay? It's just enough to cover the back of that gauntlet box there. Now, the next thing I did was, after I had decided how long the back of my box, or how wide the back of the box needed to be and how wide the front needed to be, then I decided to measure the sides to see exactly how long these side pieces of the box were going to need to be to fit the gauntlet properly. Because, you know, as you have the taper down in the front, the box is going to have to taper as well. The ends, the sides of the box here, lay this down. The sides of the box have to taper downward as well to compensate for that downward taper of the gauntlet itself. So that's good. That's a good angle. So what I did was I said, well, let's go with let's see. Let me get my protractor here. It's probably a little bit easier to see. So what I did was I measured out 3/4 of an inch on the back on each side, 3/4 of an inch from the 3-inch inner line that we made here, and just an extra 3/4 of an inch. And then on the front, I measured out 1 1/4 inches. Okay, and that gave me enough slope, enough taper here to run the taper of the box and to run the taper of the gauntlet and match almost perfectly. And now on the back where we close it in, that was a little bit more difficult. So what I did was I used my Sintra. I'm just got my paper one here handy, but I used my Sintra pattern for my paper pattern for the roll jig that we had made earlier to roll our gauntlets. I used that to get a good read of how much curve I needed to match the curve at the back of the gauntlet, and then I just used that and stopped it at that 3 inches, that 3-inch mark. Okay, and then what I did was I came down. We'll measure this out here. I came down again another 3/4 of an inch on the outsides, and then on the inside I believe it's just 1/8. Yeah, it's just 1/8 of an inch on the inside. So that's how I did my back piece that folds down to close in the back of this. And then the front piece, this square piece in the front right here, that was made simply by holding the gauntlet down, okay, and tracing the front edge of this onto a square that I had already cut out that matched the open area of the front of the box here. So I cut out a square that matched the same area as the front of the box, and then I laid the front of the gauntlet down, this edge on top of that, and then traced it. That's how I got this nice bend here that matched up real well. So that's how this pattern was made. I know it's kind of, that explanation's probably not the greatest. Most of the patterning I taught myself. There was no real videos for that back in the day. And I will do a Warmaster's Workshop video strictly on how to pattern this kind of stuff. Just be ready for some math and yeah, because I'm not even the best at math, but I had to get better at it to do patterning. So anyway, so here's our pattern for the top of our box. We're just going to go ahead and draw this out and then cut it out. So I've got just a spare piece of Sintra here. Let me clean off my work area. As you can see, I've got a very small work area here, and I'm doing that on purpose because just to show that you can do this on any work area. You don't have to have a huge desk. You can have a tiny area here and still be able to do all of this stuff. So let's go ahead and trace this out. Again, you can see I'm using a ballpoint pen because those thinner lines, they work a bit better, in my opinion, when you want to cut with an X-Acto knife. Always remember to try to hug that paper well. Hug the edge of that paper so that you get the best possible pattern you can get. The closer those lines are to the paper, the better that pattern is going to come out, the more precise. And if our pattern slips, just be real careful. Center it back in place. Make sure your lines meet up. There we go. Lines are back the way they should be. Sometimes your patterns will slip. If that happens, don't freak out. Just take your time. Center it back in place. Make sure your lines meet up to your edges appropriately, and then go back to tracing. It's not difficult. Alright, so there's that pattern right there. Now, the next thing we want to do, because we're going to have to bend this, is we want to put our bend lines. We want to go ahead and mark our bend lines. And you're going to say, well, how do we do that without cutting the pattern? Well, it's pretty easy on Sintra because Sintra is almost like carbon paper. All you got to do is press down real good and follow the lines that you've made for yourself. And remember, try to keep them straight. There's no edge here, so you just got to follow your own lines. Now I'm going to hold this up so you can see. I guess you can, yeah, you can probably see the two little imprinted lines in there? That's how we know where to fold the sides. And now we're going to do the back, because we're going to have to know where to fold the back. Again, just be real patient, lined up real nice. And then just bear down. You don't want to bear down so hard that you rip the pattern. I think that's another reason why ballpoint pens work really good for this, because you just want to bear down enough so that you get that line. And see, there you go. You can see them real good there. There's the lines that what we're going to do is we're going to carve out those lines so that we can fold this over without it breaking completely in half. We don't want it to completely break off. They will break. There will be some snapping that goes on, but we don't want them to completely break. So now we just take our X-Acto, like you're cutting anything else out, and we just cut. And just, you know, just like I've said, slow and steady wins the race when it comes to this. So always remember to watch your fingers. Make sure you don't have any appendages in the way here, because these X-Acto blades, they are not forgiving. You run one across your hand and you will remember it, and you will have a nice story to tell your finger about how they ended up calling you Nubby. And of course you want to always tick these corners a little bit. There we go. Make sure whatever cutting surface you're using, I always like to use a piece of wood for my cutting surface, because if the X-Acto cuts, it will cut through, and it's going to cut into the wood, as you can see by all the scratches here. That's not going to kill the X-Acto blade, you know. Also, if you're cutting this on a countertop, especially maybe in your mother's kitchen or your father's kitchen, don't be surprised if you become disowned. So yes, always use a piece of wood, not a countertop, to cut with an X-Acto knife. You have been warned. Yeah, a real quick way to get divorced is to cut this stuff out on your wife's nice kitchen cabinet top. So I mean, if you're looking for a good way to get divorced, there's one right there. Of course, the X-Acto knife, you're pulling it, you're not going to go all the way through at those corners, so you just want to gently kind of work it down, because you don't want to go into the box area. Of course, we're going to nick that one, yep. Now, the hardest part is always these curved areas here. So, I'm going to swap it out to a pointed X-Acto knife, or pointed X-Acto blade. Those always work a little bit better. For these more rounded cuts. Again, you want to just take it nice and slow. It's real easy for that specific area to get away from you, and you'll come out here and go, and you'll slip, and you'll slide over all this. You'll slide over any fingers that's in the way. You're just going to not have a very good day. And as you can see, I just carry it right off to the edge. And we're going to turn it and come back in the other direction because I've started to cut up into the larger piece of century here, and I don't really want to do that. There we go. Perfect. Got a little bit of an off cut there, but nothing major. Should be fine. I'm just going to go ahead and use this one to finish it off. I find that the fine-headed ones, they do take a little bit longer to cut through than the more broadhead blades. This is a broader blade. You can put more pressure on it. It will, in my opinion, if you're doing long straight cuts, that's the blade to be doing long straight cuts with. Right there. That's just a broader head. And let's see, this is the normal X-Acto knife blade. If you're doing a more fine cut, that's the one to use for that. Or rounded cuts, that works better for rounded cuts. Okay, so we save your scrap. Remember, don't throw away any scrap that looks like it's big enough to be reused. And we'll definitely need that for later. So here's our cutout box piece. Okay. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to carve out these areas that we've indented. We're going to carve them out so that we can fold these edges in and place that on top of our gauntlet and start to work on gluing that in. Alright, so what we've done here is we've started working on cut, rolling, rolling, rolling. Alright, so what we've done here is we've started working on the box that will go on the top of the gauntlet. This is the back, and we've already done one side here. And we've got to do the other side, and we've got to do the front. So I'll go ahead and I'll show you how we fold this other side up. If you look and see how I've done it on this side, you'll see that it's folded over. There's not really any sort of, there's no cracks, nothing of that nature. There's no split. It's actually still one piece. Here in the back, I've used some hot glue to hold these pieces together and across the top, and then we'll trim that out and make that nice and flush there. And then, of course, on the inside, I've put down a nice bead of hot glue here, and another bead of hot glue here, and then one in the side here. So let's go ahead and get this side scored with the knife, and I'll show you how we whittle away. One thing we're going to do first is we're going to we're going to trim a little bit off the back here. When you do this and you fold it over, you've got to trim a little bit off the back so that it stays nice and flush when you fold this. So we're going to trim just a little bit here off the back. I'm going to try to angle this so everybody can see it, but it's not going to be the easiest to do that. And what we do is you'll start at the end of the score line that we made earlier on, and you'll just come down. You'll keep it a very straight line here. And you're going to come down just like that, and just sort of slice that off. And there we go. Now we've cut that off. We'll check it again. We may need to do just a little tidy up here. We're just getting this part nice and straight. This edge really needs to be straight when you go to fold the side of this gauntlet box in. And you can just carve that right out with your X-Acto knife. Just be real careful as you do it. And there we go. Now we've got a nice straight edge. And actually, I think we need to cut that in just a little bit more. Let's cut that in. Because when we look over here on this side, I'm going to hold this up so you can see how when it folds over, okay, it has to be cut in just a little bit. So let's go in just a little bit more, because we're already going to have to score this and carve into this part here. So let's just go ahead and take out a little bit more. Doesn't have to be a whole lot, just a little bit. And then you cut that off on the back side here. There we go. Clean it up a little bit, because you will have a little bit of, there we go, debris. Clean off our board here. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and make this cut down the scored line. We scored this with a pencil, so now we're going to go over it with our X-Acto knife, and we're going to cut into it. Now you don't want to put too much pressure on it. You're not trying to cut all the way through. You're just trying to cut into the plastic, okay? But not all the way through. So we're going to make a couple of good runs here with the X-Acto knife. There we go. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come in at an angle. And by coming in at an angle, what we do is we're creating a bevel, okay? And when we bevel this, it's almost like making a small hinge, so that you can fold this side on top of, or this side in, and there's enough room here for those two edges to meet, and it won't cause a lot of, they'll kind of just marry right up together. So we're going to start with small cuts, and you want to hold you're going to hold this at an angle when you do this, because you want this cut to go from deep in the middle to shallow on the outside. So, and you're going to see it's going to bring up, just like it's doing now, it's going to bring up a little bit of plastic here. See, that's what you want. You want to be able to bring it like that. It's almost like you're shaving little bits of it back without going all the way through the plastic. Now we're going to do it again. A little bit deeper. And you kind of have to change the positioning that you're holding your X-Acto knife. But you want to make sure that you're bringing up material as you do this. And you don't want to go too deep. You're just scoring that edge. and you're creating that bevel. Now I'm going to bring it up here so you can see it. And see, I don't know if you can see it well or not. There's a nice little bevel right here. Now we're going to do the other side as well. The other side is usually, depending on what your dominant hand is. For me, it's easier to just use my right, so I'll turn it so that I can continue to use my right hand. And you want to try to keep that bevel line the same thickness all the way down. And just watch and make sure that you are actually lifting material. Because if your bevel is too light, then you're just going to crack that outer edge. Which, I mean, it's not a huge issue, but if you can keep from cracking it, it just leaves a little bit of a cleaner edge. Alright, so we go back to the other side and we do it again. And we just make it a little bit deeper. And you may have to, you may not, the material itself may not free up. You may have to go back and do a little bit of counter carving to free the material up itself that you've just carved into, but just take your time and be patient. That's the name of the game, is patience. Let's switch over and see if maybe the broadhead might do a little bit better job. This blade is not as sharp as the other blade. Alright, now we're going to do this other side. And we should, if we've got this bevel deep enough, we should be just about at where we want to be. To bend this over. Now we're just going to, like I said, you just got to pull that. You'll have to pull some of those little pieces out. I'll switch back over to my finer blade here. You may have to move the piece around a good little bit to find the angle that works the best for you. Just remember not to dig too deep. Alright, now we've got that bevel line made. Let me get a little bit more here on the edge. Alright, so now we're going to do our fold over. Just be kind of gentle with it. If it cracks, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. But you just kind of coax it over. You don't want to apply heat to it to do this because you'll bend the edges of this box. You do not want to do that. Alright, so there we go. And you're going to see this corner up here is going to get some white coloration, which means it's under a lot of pressure. So And then what you can do is you can take your X-Acto and go back in here and make another score. That'll help relieve a little bit more pressure. If you see any little areas that might need some work, just grab your X-Acto knife, do a little bit of trimming in there, and it should slide right into place. What I'll do is I like to push that edge up a little bit so I can get a good push in here. Alright, so now we've got our box. Okay, there's our top box built. We're going to go ahead and hot glue it so that it will hold together. Now, one thing I want to say here is this hot glue, okay? Just be real careful with the hot glue. The stuff, it does burn, and it is a burn that does not stop burning until it cools down. So once you get it on yourself, you're pretty much you're going to be in a tight spot until it cools off, and it gets all over everything. So we're just going to run a nice thick bead in here. What that'll also do is that'll actually, that heat is going to heat that corner up and allow it to bend in a little bit more as you're holding it. So you get it at you're able to work it in a little bit more. And then you just hold it. Now comes the waiting game. We just hold it until it dries. It may take 5 minutes. It may take 10 minutes. If you have a fan, you know, like a little, maybe like a little floor fan or a little countertop fan or something, you may want to hold it in front of that. If you have an air conditioner, you can hold it in front of that. Something to get some nice cool air on it to get it, you know, to get it to cool down quicker. So we're going to let this cool down, and then we're going to come back to it, and I'll show you a few things we can do before we put it on the gauntlet top and seal up the front. Alright, so our gauntlet box has dried. The hot glue is dried in there. We've got beads on the inside. I put another little bead on the outside while it was drying right back here. You can see already how it's going to fit on the gauntlet. So that's what she'll look like when she's on the gauntlet. Okay. Now, if you're wanting to do some any kind of further customizations, now would be the time to do that before you put the front of this box on and attach it to the gauntlet. You can put some circuitry. You know, the easiest way to do it would be to maybe cut out some little holes or drill some holes in here. You could put some LEDs in if you wanted to have some lights. That kind of thing. We're not going to do that with these, but now would be the time to cut out any areas where you want to have buttons or any kind of details that will be recessed, not just sticking on top of the gauntlet. Because those, like I said before, they just never look as good as if they're recessed details, buttons, switches, circuitry, that kind of thing. So now what we're going to do is we're going to clean up the back of this a little bit where we've got the hot glue. So we're just going to take our X-Acto and we're just going to lightly trim off this excess hot glue, just like that, so that you don't have glue blobs where the glue has just, you know, where we've put it on, because hot glue, you do have to kind of build it up. And in the drying, you know, in the drying phase or the cooling down phase, you've got to have a good amount of hot glue on the object to get it to hold together. And then once it's dry, you can trim off that excess hot glue. So that's basically what we're doing here. We're just trimming that excess off. Just be real careful. Go slow. Don't cut into your plastic. Whatever you do, don't do that. So yeah, just take it slow, because you don't want people to see that there's hot glue on here. Now the next thing we want to do is, and I've got some around here somewhere, here we go. I've got some real fine grit sandpaper. I think this is actually like 1,000 grit. It's almost just like emery cloth, but we'll go over this hot glue back here with it, because it is so fine that it doesn't leave a whole bunch of those little threads that hot glue likes to leave, those little raised up threads. And then you can take your finger and run over that, and it will, whatever's extra is pulled up by this 1,000 grit will actually be lifted off by just the friction of your finger to give it a much smoother look. See, if you use a sander on this stuff, you will eat through it in a heartbeat, and then you'll get down into your actual plastic, and that's what you don't want. You don't want that to happen. Plus, we're going to be using some Bondo on this as well, so if we've got some sunk-in areas, the Bondo will be filling in those areas as well. So we just want to do this to kind of heat the glue up just a little bit without tearing up the plastic itself. So like I said, we run our finger over it to pull off all the little hot glue tags that might be sticking up. And then once we do that, we've got a relatively flat surface without any of that excess hot glue bubbles or globs or any of that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to make a pattern of the front part here, okay? And then we're also going to use the bottom part or the top part of the gauntlet to help with that. So we need to get a piece of paper, which I've got plenty of. Should be just the right size. And what I do is I take this box and I'll set it on a piece of paper, and then I'll get my trusty ink pen and I'll go around and I'll trace the front of this box from the outside. And then what I do is I take my pen and I go on the inside and I trace it there as well. Now you're going to say, well, why do you trace on the inside and the outside? Well, what it does, it gives me a good idea of how the entire front edge of this box is going to look like. So now we've got the entire front edge of the box, and it gives me a good view of any possible deviations in the way that things should be sitting. And there is a little bit of a curve, or there is a little bit of a angle here on this side, but it's nothing that's really going to cause any issues. You're not really going to notice it, especially since it's on the outside, but you can see it there. But what it also allows us to do is we can set this, the bottom or the top piece here, the top clamshell, we can set that. Hopefully I'm not blocking out the picture here. We can set this inside of there and see just about how big we need that to be. Now we're having to do a little bit of eyeballing here. But that's going to be about right as far as the depth. Now we can take a small ruler and we can measure the depth on the one that we've already made, which, taking a depth measurement, is basically going from the top of the gauntlet clamshell to right here at the bottom edge of the box. So we're going to measure the depth of that, how deep that needs to be. Okay, and we've got our measurement there. Alright, so that's basically 4/8. No, I'm sorry, that wasn't 4/8. 4/8 would be half an inch. That's 3/8. Okay, so we know where we're at here. So let's go ahead and trace this. And we will measure here. Yep, that looks about right. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to cut this out. We're going to cut this pattern out. And for that, I have a pair of scissors. That's going to be a lot easier than using an X-Acto knife. So using a pair of scissors, we cut this out. And make sure you're careful and slow and patient when you cut these patterns out, because if you screw it up, it's just going to take that much longer to fix the screw ups. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to have to we don't want to have to fix screw ups. So, all right. So right there's our pattern. So now all we need is a small piece of Centra, which we've got plenty of those. And we just trace this out. And there we go. We have the front of our box. Now, if you wanted to make a couple holes in here, whatever, to maybe put a couple prop darts or a couple little prop blaster barrels or whatever you want to do, now would be the best time to do that before you actually put it on the front of the box. So, using our X-Acto knife, again, we're just going to go down through here and make our cuts. This is such a small piece, so I'm just going to use my fine pointed blade for this. Plus we have this little turn here, which what I like to do sometimes for these turns is just take the X-Acto, almost kind of like a sewing machine or a leather punch. Just punch around those corners there. Just like that. Now on this side, of course the same. Alright, so see, that's what you want to avoid. Luckily, that was on the part we didn't need. But you see how easy it is to get off of your cutting line. And when you do, you can really cause some problems for your for the parts that, for the area that you absolutely cannot cut into. So that's why it's always good to be patient. Alright, and that should pop right off. Now, that's how it's going to fit on there. Now, obviously, we see that we've got some gaps here, and that's just because we cut it at a little bit of an angle here, so you can go down through here. Just make sure your fingers are out of the way. Now, all we've got to do at this point is trim these little areas off here, and then glue this to the top of our box, or to the top of our gauntlet. So let's go ahead and glue this part together so that we can trim it. I don't want to trim it until we glue it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it down on here, on my work area, my workbench area here, and make sure that that's nice and flat. And then I'm going to take my glue gun, and I'm going to run a bead in here, right along that edge on the inside. I'm going to run another bead along the top edge here. Alright, and then you're just going to leave it there for a little bit. We're going to let that dry. And then once that dries, then we'll trim off these little areas, and we'll stick that to the top of our gauntlet, and then we'll be ready to go. After that, it'll just be fill in and cleaning it up, and then attaching both halves together. Alright, so here we have our gauntlet, our top clamshell to our gauntlet, and we've set the box on top of it, okay? This isn't a permanent attachment yet. We're just getting a good idea of where it needs to go, okay? So you just want to size it up. The main thing is you want to make sure that you look down the center here and that it is centered, that the box is centered onto the clamshell, okay? That is super duper important, because that's where you're going to have that's where you're going to get your final look at how this thing's supposed to sit on there. So we know where it's supposed to be now. So what we've got to do now is we've got to glue this box on so that we can start filling in around the edges and making it look as seamless as possible. So we're going to use hot glue to attach these together, since it is all plastic. So what I do is I just run a really thick bead of hot glue, as thick as I can get it. And you have several minutes to make this happen, but I run a thick bead of hot glue all around here, the inside, the edges. Try to keep it from being, from getting too globby though, because that's just that much more you're going to have to fix. And then we just set it down on here. Just make sure you're really careful. And what I like to do is push the back down so that it's nice and flush. Same thing with the front. You want to make sure you're checking for centering. Because this glue it's not super hot now. I run my finger over to try to get up as much of that excess as possible. But I keep pushing the back down because you want that to be as flush as you can make it. If it bends a little bit right in here, that's okay. It's not going to hurt anything. Nobody's going to notice it. By the time you paint these suckers up, by the time we fill them in and you paint them up, nobody's going to notice any of that. So just run your fingers through there, get that excess off. Any lines, any hot glue lines, little threads of hot glue, you want to make sure those are off. And what I like to do is look inside here as well, just to see how much hot glue actually got on the gauntlet. Now on this side we did pretty good. This side is raised a little bit more, so it didn't get nearly as much hot glue. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold this to it here, and I'm going to shoot some hot glue in there and make a bead all the way down. Remember, this is going to be filled in with Bondo, so nobody's even going to see any of that. But you want to make sure that you get a nice, you want to make sure that it's, that you've got plenty of adhesive around there, because if you don't, this thing, it will pop off. That would not be good, These are not going to be the strongest gauntlets in the world, but they'll be stout enough for your costume. They'll be plenty good for that, but you want to give yourself as much advantage as possible with that box being on there, because the box actually adds a layer of structural integrity. So let's compare these two together. I'm not expecting them to be absolutely perfect, because we're going to be sanding a little bit on this gauntlet anyway. But I don't expect it to be 100% perfect, but it's pretty close. It's not bad, because we are making these. It's not like these things are made out of a mold. We are making these things by hand, so there will be from scratch. So there'll be a little bit more. There'll be flaws. There will potentially be flaws, and you need to be ready for that. And don't let that bother you, because, just the fact that it's made from scratch is what's really neat. So, alright, so that's dried on there now. Now the next thing we've got to do is start filling in these seam areas, because we don't want it to look like there is any sort of space between this. We want to make it look like it's one piece. Okay? So to do that, we get a nice little mixture of chemicals and fiberglass called Bondo. And I like to use Bondo glass. It's because it has little bits of fiberglass in it. One thing you want to make sure you have is some vinyl gloves. Alright? That way you keep this stuff off your hands. It is, I believe it is carcinogenic. If it's not, I'll be surprised. But, so what we're going to do is, move all this stuff over. What we're going to do here is, we're going to take our Bondo, we're going to take some hardener, and we're going to fill in these cracks. So I have a piece of metal that I use here for dipping Bondo out. I'm just using an old piece of Sintra as a mixing palette. Now you don't want to use a whole lot of Bondo, because It will dry quickly unless you're in like the Arctic. It's going to dry fairly quickly, so you don't want to use a lot. So I'm just using little tiny bits. I mean, we're talking like less than a teaspoon at a time. All right. Got some dried Bondo on my paddle from yesterday. Now, these things are really nice to have. These are Bondo paddles. They're made specifically for spreading Bondo by Bondo. And so we're going to put a little bit of hardener, and I'm going to show you exactly how much I'm putting in here. It's not going to be much. It's a tiny bit, and that may even be too much. It is not. It's not hard to put too much hardener in. So that's how much hardener I've put into that much Bondo. I can't even tell you what ratio that is. I just eyeball it, you know. And like I said, that may even be a little too much. Probably could have went with a touch less. You can always add a little bit more before you mix it. A little bit more of the green Bondo itself, the resin and fiberglass mixture. And this stuff's going to start kicking off literally as soon as you stir it up. So you're not going to have a lot of time. So what we're going to do, we get a little bit of Bondo on our paddle like this, and you put it in that crack there, and you run it across just like that. A little bit more. And if you didn't mix enough Bondo, that's okay. It is not a problem. It's better, and when it comes to Bondo, it's better to not mix enough than mix too much. Because even if you mix too much, you are going to lose it. The other great thing about Bondo, too, is that it doesn't stick very well to Sintra. So all this excess Bondo that we've got right down here will easily be removable. So that's our first bit. We're going to put another bit behind that once this dries, but we just want to shape it up a little bit. See how nice and smooth that looks? Now we'll put another layer on there. What I'm going to do here is just, yeah, I can feel it starting to kick now. You'll know the Bondo is starting to kick when it starts getting this like pudding consistency. It'll feel literally like a pudding. See how it's starting to like kind of puttyish? That's the best time to clean it off as well. And it, as you can see, it comes right off the paddle. So what I do here is I take the paddle and I'll run it up through here. I'll pull off as much of that excess Bondo as I can. And let's mix another little batch. So again, we just need a little bit, not a lot. People are bad about using way too much Bondo, or mixing up too much, and then losing it before they actually have time to work with it. It's called pot life. How much life does it have in the pot after you've mixed it before it's just too hard? You're probably going to get, you need to have the Bondo in where you want it within 5 minutes of mixing it. That's what I would say, within 5 minutes, because it's going to kick off pretty fast. If you get anything in your Bondo, try to get it out if you can. Again, you just want a little bit, just a touch. Literally like a drop of hardener is all you need for this much Bondo. Just like that. That's a drop of hardener for this, or drop of hardener to maybe 3/4 of a teaspoon of the resin fiberglass mixture Bondo. And you want to stir it real good so it gets a nice dark brown color. Alright, and then you take a little bit on your paddle here. Try to keep those strings off. And then you run it up, right up the side. If you got some hardener showing that didn't mix very well, it's okay. Not going to hurt anything. It'll just mix in as you're doing this. Trying to get too much Bondo on there because I don't want it. It's that much more mess you've got to clean up. Alright, so now we take the paddle up and we sweep upwards. That helps equalize the excess Bondo and where it's at. Don't forget the little front, your little front area here. Bondo's starting to kick, so I gotta really get this done. Alright, so yep, it's all kicked at this point. Alright, so there we're at. There's where we are at with this side. Alright, we can see that we still have a little bit more we need to add over here. And then we need to clean this up, which we can do now. See how easy that just comes off? Now, if you don't want the Bondo to come off so easy, which that shouldn't really be a problem for these, but in other projects where you might be using Sintra, and you may be covering the entire piece of Sintra with Bondo, what you want to do is you're going to want to sand it with like 80 grit or 60 grit, a fairly rough grit sandpaper. And what that will do is that will give texture for the Bondo to hold on to. Okay. And I don't want to pull off too much of this right yet until we get, because we're going to be able to trim this with our X-Acto knife as well. So, but anyway, there's a nice flat line of Bondo, and we'll sand that down so that it's nice and even, so that it looks, so it'll look like that. All right, so we did some sanding off camera and got the Bondo nice and smooth here on the sides. It's cured. It's not. It's actually holding on really well. It's holding on better on this gauntlet than it is on the other. But as I said before, you want to try to get off all this loose Bondo as well that might be on here. It'll come off pretty easy with just maybe 120 or I'd say 120 grit sandpaper. I don't know that I'd go much more harsh than that. You may start cutting into the Sintra a little bit too much with a harsher paper than that. So we've got a little bit of a abrupt ending back here, and we got a little bit of an air bubble. So we need to fill that up. So what I'm going to do here, since that opened up while we were sanding, I'm just going to poke at it a bit with the X-Acto knife to get the dust out of there, because that will be not helpful at all when you go to fill them in. It will keep the Bondo from getting in there and actually bonding, and you want to get that out of there, because you want the Bondo to do what the name says it does, bond. So let's go ahead and let's mix up a little more Bondo, and we'll fill that in. We're not going to need much for that, just a tiny touch of Bondo. I mean, we're talking that right there is probably plenty, maybe even more than we need. But we'll put a little bit of hardener in there. It's not going to require much hardener either. One thing I want to mention too while we're doing this is you can see how big my work area is here. It's actually very small. It's just a really it's just an actual little work top that I made that I can kind of put, I can put it on my legs if I want to. And yeah, that's too much hardener. There we go. I can literally just prop it on my legs if I want to and work on stuff that way. So it's kind of just a little portable work bench. So even if you've got, if you don't have much space where you're working at, you can make a little portable, kind of a little portable bench top like this, and basically put it anywhere. It allows you to cut, and all that without screwing up any of your, any nice countertops. So, all right. So we're just filling this in back here in the back, and bringing it around on the back side, which is always kind of difficult to do. These rubber paddles are the best things ever invented for Bondo. Alright, so we got that done, so we're just going to let that cure while we start working on the other side here. And this stuff is actually not kicked off yet, so I don't want to waste any. Alright, so let's go ahead and clean off our palette there again. I don't suggest throwing your unused Bondo on the floor, mixed Bondo on the floor. I do it on my shop because usually it dries before it hits the ground, and it's not, it doesn't stick. So, or it dries before it hits the floor, I should say. All right, so we're not going to use a lot here. We don't want to go too crazy because we know how fast this stuff likes to kick off. That might be, half a teaspoonful right there. And then with our hardener again, we literally just want to drop, guys and girls, just a drop. Like that right there. I mean, let's put a little bit more just in case. There we go. Literally, that's a drop. I mean, it might be a touch more than a drop, but it's pretty close to a drop. We'll say a drop and a half. But you can get away with a drop. It just takes a little bit longer to cure. So we mix this up real good. As always, make sure you get all that green resin in there. If you're using regular Bondo, it'll be more red. I just like using the Bondo glass because it has those bits of fiberglass in there. Alright, so we're going to start in the front and just work our way back, pushing this, bringing it in, pushing it a little more. Grab the rest of this here. And then of course we drag it forward to get a nice even line there. We'll get the back. I'm sorry, the front, my bad. This is the back. And see, when you don't overmix when you don't add too much hardener, this stuff will actually have a fairly nice pot life. I can tell it's starting to kick, so I gotta hurry here. Drag it across again. We'll grab this excess off of here. Now it may take a little bit longer for this side to cure because we didn't put a lot of hardener in there. One thing about it too is that if you're good with your sanding, it really doesn't matter how high you build this up right through here. You'll be able to get it down. Now I'm going to sand off camera. You don't really need to see me sanding, and I'm going to cheat and probably use my my sanding wheel, since that's a whole lot easier for me. If you don't have a sanding wheel, you're stuck with good old-fashioned elbow grease and some sandpaper. So yeah, we're going to need to yeah, it's kicking off. We're going to have to do a little bit more right there, but that's all right. We'll get to that. Let's let this cure. We're going to let that cure, and then we're going to sand it down, and we're going to come back and look at how nice and clean that is, and then we'll seal up. We'll use some more Bondo back here to get this, and we'll use a little Bondo up here to get this, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you saw that, but we're going to put some Bondo back here to just seal up this little seam, and we'll put some Bondo up here to seal this seam. We're going to hot glue this seam here, okay? And we're going to, I believe we've already got that one hot glued, so we're going to have to hot glue the seam on this front piece right here. As you can see, we're going to hot glue that one, and then that'll be done. We'll be done with the box, the box building of the Gauntlet at that point. Alright, so we've got our Gauntlet, or Vambrace, top half of the clamshell here. We've got it sealed up with Bondo, I should say filled in. We've got all these big gap areas that were here filled in with Bondo. Around the front, I just ran a hot glue bead and then used some really high grit, I believe this is like 1,000 grit, sandpaper here to heat it up and get rid of all the little, sanded it down, but it got rid of all these little hairs of glue that kind of stick up. Same thing with the back. There's a few still back here on the back, but nothing major. Nothing that when we go to seal it, that won't the sealer we're going to use will cover them up. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get the hinge started. All right. And if you remember, the Gauntlet is going to open from the outside, okay? So we want the hinge to go on the inside. You always put your hinge on the inside of the Gauntlet here. And what I'm using is, this is just a piece of piano hinge. The other piece of this hinge is on the other Gauntlet. But as you can see here, and it does a really good job of opening and closing it, and it's, you know, it actually helps to add a bit of friction so that when this is velcroed together here, the Gauntlet won't just arbitrarily pop off. Okay, so that's what I use. I use piano hinge. I've always used piano hinge. I use piano hinge in my metal gaunts too, because I can just weld that right on, and it's no big deal. But we're going to glue this on, and what we're going to do what we're going to use is good old-fashioned Gorilla Glue. This stuff works like a champ. It's the perfect thing to bond the hinge to the plastic. And the first thing you want to do, what I do, is I stuff up where I'm going to put the hinge inside the gauntlet here. I stuff it with some sandpaper just so I know that the glue is going to get some really good adhesion. You want that. You want it to stick, okay? And you can scuff up the top edge of your hinge as well with the sandpaper. I don't know that it really does that much good. What I kind of rely on is the glue to come out these little screw down holes. The glue will come out and it'll kind of make a little, what I like to call a little rivet of glue that will bond and hold this down. Of course, it'll bond on this side too, but it's nice to have that little bit of glue that permeates these mounting holes here. That'll give you some extra strength, some extra holding power. So we scuff that up a little bit, and what we do here now, Gorilla Glue. You've got to use water on Gorilla Glue for it to really work well. So what we're going to do, we're going to put a nice, pretty good size, pretty thick line of Gorilla Glue here. Some people say you don't need this much. I would rather have more Gorilla Glue than I need, and then just trim and sand off whatever extra there is that comes out. Because what happens is, as this stuff dries after you put water on it, it starts to expand. So yeah, you got to be watchful for that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to dip our finger. Make sure you got gloves on for this, please. We're going to dip our finger in the water, and we're just going to go down through here, and get water on that glue. And we're going to water it down fairly well, spread it out a little bit here. And then I'm going to shake that a little bit to get the excess off. I shook the gauntlet a bit, and then we take our hinge here, and you want to line it up so that you get so that the edges are fully enclosed by the lip edge of the gauntlet. So you want to make sure that this is nice and centered in the gauntlet there. And then I get some clamps. All right, I'm going to clamp each side down. These are just regular old rubber clamps, or I should say plastic clamps. The glue will bond to them. That's okay though, because you can pop them off still. I just run an X-Acto knife under them to get underneath that Gorilla Glue before it completely cures. Now, all right, so we've got. Let's put one more clamp on it just to be safe. Alright, so we've got 4 clamps on it here. And I just noticed I got some Gorilla Glue on the gauntlet. So if you do get glue on the gauntlet, it's not the worst thing that could happen. I'm just going to take these gloves, since I've been wearing them for a while now. They need to be changed out anyway. I'm just going to wipe it off with my glove. And it's off of there. But what you want to do is you want to let this sit. I'll tell you what else I'm going to do. Let's turn these. There we go. You want to let this sit. Preferably, you want to let this cure overnight. You can speed it along, and I'm going to lift this up so you can see where the Gorilla Glue is already starting to kick off. See where that's starting to kind of get a foamy look to it? That means it's already starting to kick off and cure. So we want it to come out those holes, and it should, because it's going to go the route of least resistance. So it's probably going to come out those holes anyway. But you can see how fast it kicks off. The more water you put on it, the better it kicks. So what you can do, and I'm going to show you this real quick. What you can do is you can use a heat gun and you can kind of speed it along. So we're going to do that. I'm not going to turn it all the way up, though. I'm going to turn it about, I've got the heat gun about a third of the way up, and I'm just kind of feeling the heat for myself here. I'm going to lay this down. And I'm going to let the heat gun work its magic here. Let me get the bottle of Gorilla Glue off. And you're going to be able to see this start to kick and cure. See, I'm sure you can already see it. Now we're not going to I'm not going to let the whole thing cure right now. I'm not going to cure it all with this. I'm just going to show you how you can use a glue gun to cure this glue. Now, something else we're going to have to do is you're going to get, as you can see, you've got some actually running out of the hinge area here. I'll point you with a pencil so you can see it. We've got some actually coming out of the hinge area. That's fine. What we'll do is we'll take the X-Acto knife and we'll get that out of there. Once it's dry, you can just take your X-Acto knife and pop it right out. It'll just clean right out. Alright, so this is kicked off pretty well. I mean, you can even watch it expand with the heat. So that's kicked off pretty well. I'm going to wipe this a little bit off here. I mean, if you can wipe it off, you're always better trying to get it off. It's less work you have to do later. But you're not going to get it all. So you might as well just let it cure. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this at an angle that coaxes that glue to move downward. We'll be able to sand all that down if it gets pretty high once it expands. Let's move this back. You can adjust your clips a little bit if necessary, just to keep them from getting too inundated with the glue. So that's where we're at now. I'm going to let this dry. It's probably going to take, well, it will definitely take all night to dry. And we'll come back to it, and we'll get the other side glued on. Alright, so we're back with our gauntlets. I went ahead and, off camera, I went ahead and finished gluing this gauntlet together. And as you can see, I've got it glued on both sides with the Gorilla Glue. I took a little bit off here because it was sticking over. You got to watch this stuff because the Gorilla Glue, of course, it kind of puffs up as it cures. The more water you put on it, the more it puffs up and the stronger it cures. So I trimmed a little bit off because there was a rough area there. But the gauntlets together, it's all filled in with Bondo and some hot glue around the edges. And after I got them together, what I did was I took some 120 grit sandpaper and I went over the entire surface of the Sintra here, of the plastic, because you're going to want to spray this. You can spray it with a sealer, like an epoxy sealer, or you can just go ahead and prime it and paint it. Now, one thing you've got to remember is that because of the fact that this plastic does flex, I'm going to hold this up to see if you guys can see it a little bit as you're watching it here, but as it flexes, see, you're going to see how it the Bondo kind of separates a bit. That's just because of the flexion of the plastic. You know, it's not, nobody's ever going to really notice it, especially once it's primed and painted. You're not really going to see that flexion happen. The paint will flex a little bit with it. But if you want to spray it down with an epoxy sealer, you can try several different methods. But I wouldn't put anything on it that would, of course, it would break down plastic. So nothing polyester based, nothing polyester based or anything that maybe is oil based. That might harm the plastic. But other than that, I mean, these are pretty much ready to go. If you want to, like I was saying before, if you wanted to put some electronics or something up here on the top of the box, you can always cut out on the inside, just take a rotary tool, or you could even take an X-Acto knife and just score it until you get a nice cut, and just cut a little rectangle or some squares or whatever out of here, so that you can put your circuitry and your battery in there, and then you can drill some holes up here to lay in some LEDs and that kind of thing. If you wanted to put like a mock keypad, just you'd want to trace your keypad and then trace a little bit on the inside of that, so that you're making a bezel so that the keypad fits inside the gauntlet and not just sticking it on top of the gauntlet. You don't want to just stick stuff like circuitry and things of that nature on top of the plastic, because it just looks super unfinished and doesn't really look all that great quality-wise. But I'll go ahead and put one of these on so you can see exactly how well it fits. This is the left gauntlet. So for me, this is still a little bit tighter than I would probably like in the front for my wrist, but and there it is. So now of course there's a little bit of a gap in the back here. You can put some padding up here to make it a nice tight fit, or you can just close it a little tighter, either way. But as you can see, I don't have a whole lot of, there's a little bit of twist, but because the underside is rolled a little tight, it is a little bit of a tight fit on the front. But again, that's kind of the nature of making gauntlets that where one side goes underneath the other one. But it does fit. I mean, it does fit well. It's comfortable. It doesn't feel bad or anything of that nature. It does brace my wrists, so I don't think my wrist will get broken, these things, if I were to wear them. But another thing you want to make sure you do too before you put them on is take some sandpaper and go around the inside edges. I go around the inside and the outside. I'll hold this up here so you can see. But you want to round those off. Sintra is fairly sharp, okay? And it will cut you very easily. I've been cut many times by Sintra. So you want to round all these edges off, okay? Because that's just going to make it that much more comfortable. Also, when you put your when you're doing your hinge here, you're going to have to cut a little bit off. After you put it in, I cut a little bit of it off right here. Now you could ask, well, why don't you just make it straight on? Well, I like to keep a little bit of metal out here, because that metal actually acts as a brace for the plastic. So if you hit this edge up against something, it's less likely to crack or snap off, okay? So that's why I just put the metal as close to the edge as I can. Same thing on this side. I did the same thing. I just cut down the after I put the hinge on, I cut it down, and then I took my Dremel with a grinding bit and just made it nice and smooth right in through here, and then took my sandpaper and of course rounded all these edges where skin is going to touch it. So that's it. I mean, that's our gauntlets. They look good. This is actually the first set of plastic gauntlets I think I've ever made, but they came out really well. And I'm pretty happy with them, and hopefully you guys and girls have learned how to make a set for yourself. It's not that hard. Altogether, if I had worked on these non-stop, I could have probably had them all done in 2 to 3 days time, as far as to this point here, to where they're ready to prime and paint. A couple days, maybe 3, if I had just worked on them all day. The main wait is, of course, waiting for your glue to dry for your hinge there. Now, since I started working on these, I think it's taken about a week to make these right now, considering the filming and all that stuff. So it doesn't really take that long to make these. And of course, we've got the Boba Fett patterns on the Mandalorian Mercs website, www.mandalorianmercs.org. I may put the box pattern up. If I do, I'll throw a link to it. Just look for a link in the description on the YouTube video. So anyway, hopefully you guys and girls will have yourselves some really cool plastic gauntlets. I look forward to seeing what everybody does. And thanks for joining me at another Warmasters workshop. And we'll see you at the next one.